Iran entered a period of tension like a pressure cooker with the lid clamped shut. Their economy wasn't just struggling, it was sliding fast. The currency's collapse pushed prices up day after day. Inflation ate away at ordinary purchasing power. Things that used to feel normal, food, medicine, fuel, became more expensive and harder to get. When daily life is squeezed that tight, social reaction starts to surface. In Tehran, merchants in the Grand Bazaar, long seen as the beating heart of the traditional economic bloodstream, shut their stalls and walked into the streets. That move carried heavy symbolism, because it showed frustration was no longer confined to a small group. It was spreading into the classes that are usually seen as the ones who keep the rhythm of the economy. Within days, protests spread to multiple cities, with multiple groups joining in. Students, truck drivers, factory workers, day laborers. This was no longer a march over one single cause. It looked more like a chain of breaks snapping one after another, reflecting a fracture from within. In that setting, Iran's leadership was pushed into a difficult position. They had to deal with pressure at home, while still projecting firm control to the outside world. And when a society sits in prolonged instability, every hard response carries the risk of making the next flare-up even more intense. But the story didn't stop at internal unrest. Iran had also just come through a tense stretch of military confrontation with Israel. Strikes aimed at forces and connected networks inflicted significant damage. In the eyes of the region, a state that always wants to project strength suddenly showed visible cracks. Hit from the outside and shaken from the inside, Iran became more vulnerable than it had been in a long time. And it is precisely this cornered moment that gives outside warnings a different kind of weight. When a country is compressed by multiple layers of pressure at once, one more push can be enough to shift the balance. That's the key backdrop for understanding why the next moves in this story are framed as signs that the board is being set, rather than as a single political headline. With Iran splitting internally and still worn down after a tense confrontation, a message was released at the most sensitive moment. It wasn't a long speech, it was a short warning, dropped at a time when most people were asleep. But the timing and the language are what made it unusual. The message said that if Iran's government shot and killed peaceful protesters, the United States would step in to rescue them. And then came the military phrase, locked and loaded. This isn't the kind of wording you expect from diplomacy. Diplomacy usually leaves room for interpretation. Diplomacy usually keeps a door open for negotiation, but locked and loaded shuts down the escape lanes. It suggests forces are already ready, posture is already set, and one move past the line could flip everything into a new state. What stands out is that this warning was aimed at Iran right when the country was being pressed from multiple angles. Language like that isn't just talk. It draws a new psychological boundary in the confrontation. It forces the side being warned to weigh every response, because any hard crackdown can be read as a pretext for escalation. And Iran's response wasn't soft either. They fired back with threats to spread chaos across the region and to target US interests. When both sides speak in that kind of heavy language, tension doesn't release. It compresses, like a rope being pulled tighter by degrees. But there's a subtle point here. This still wasn't war. No armies crossed borders. No missiles flew over capital cities. Yet it wasn't peace either. It was an in-between state. Everything pushed higher, but not detonated. It creates the sense that something is approaching. And when that in-between stretches out, the danger is that the distance between threats and real action can shrink at any moment. In the video's logic, this becomes the base for the next interpretive frame. Not just watching events, but watching how the pieces are being placed into position. To explain why Iran is described as a hotspot with prophetic coloring, the video pulls the viewer away from today's headlines and back into an older foundation. Modern Iran, in the ancient world, is tied to the name Persia. And Persia doesn't appear only in passing, it's a familiar presence in biblical stories and settings. Persia was the empire that replaced Babylon. Power shifts in the ancient world, as this narrative presents them, create the impression that nations are not only political entities, but also characters in a long-running flow. So when Iran is pulled into the center of attention, the video wants the viewer to see it as a nation with an identity stretching back thousands of years, not just a point on a modern map. From there, a core claim is introduced. Persia is named directly in a prophetic passage tied to a major end-times alliance. But the video also works to keep a clear boundary. It stresses that what's happening now is not direct fulfillment. There is no invasion like the one described. There is no explosive moment that instantly rearranges the order of things. Instead, the point is simpler but heavier. Prophecy doesn't begin with the final event. Prophecy begins with the parties taking position. Alliances form gradually. Axes of confrontation get locked in. Economic and military lines tighten and bind. Like a stage being built before the curtain rises, the preparation is often quiet, but it determines everything that comes after. And viewed through that positioning lens, Iran is described as moving along a clear track. Iran deepens ties with strategic partners. Iran confronts Israel in multiple layers, from statements to regional influence to proxy networks. That makes Iran both the focal point of current tension and a piece that can connect into wider scenarios. In that backdrop, the phrase "locked and loaded" isn't just a harsh sentence. It reads like a red dot circled on a map, signaling that a piece has been blocked and every next move will carry a higher price. This is the key transition before the video opens the wars and rumors of wars frame and the birth pangs model in the next section. After laying the groundwork around Iran and the idea of positioning, the video shifts into a model-based frame. It doesn't want viewers to stare at one isolated incident. It wants them to see a process. Here, the phrase "wars and rumors of wars" is used as a name for an in-between condition. It's the stage where people hear thunder but don't yet see the rain fall. Tension is obvious. Threats have been spoken, postures have been set, but full-scale war still hasn't broken out. That is what makes this moment so unpredictable. Because when a situation is stretched tight, a small touch can be enough to snap the line. And "locked and loaded" is treated as a loud signal that makes the rumors of war less vague and more concrete, sharper and more frightening. From there, the video introduces the image of birth pangs, contractions. The metaphor creates a very visual way of reading the pattern. Early contractions are spaced out and light. There's still time between them to steady yourself, but later they come closer together, hit harder, and the gap between waves of pain keeps shrinking. The key point in this argument is not that the world has never seen war, crisis, or sanctions. Those have existed for a long time. The difference is the tempo. Events no longer show up in isolation. They start stacking. They arrive closer together. And when the tempo changes, human perception changes with it. People can take one shock and recover, but when the next shock lands too quickly, the mind and the system don't have time to stabilize. That's why the video leans on a detail that sounds small, but functions as the main axis. The gap is narrowing. Iran is being pressured, but it's not only Iran. Another front is being tightened at the same time. When pressure rises simultaneously in multiple places, it creates the feeling that an invisible hand is pushing the pieces closer, faster, with fewer options. In this telling, contractions are not only war. They are threats, sanctions, alliances being reshaped, decisions coming in rapid sequence. And as the distance between contractions shrinks, a question starts to surface. Is this just a run of coincidences, or a sign that a process is moving into an accelerated phase? That becomes the pivot for the next part. explaining why Venezuela, far from Jerusalem, gets pulled into the same picture. When the story is centered on Iran and the Middle East, bringing Venezuela into it can feel strange. A South American country, thousands of kilometers from Jerusalem, doesn't sit on the hot borders around Israel. But that distance is exactly what the video wants to use. It lays down a principle. In the modern world, influence isn't measured only by geography or tanks at a border. Influence also runs through economics, oil, supply chains, and the relationships that can keep a regime alive. A country doesn't have to be next to the Middle East to affect the Middle East. If it controls a resource the world depends on, it has soft power and sometimes hard power. Here, Venezuela is framed as an oil gate of the Western Hemisphere. Oil is a special kind of commodity. It isn't just fuel, it's money. It's the ability to keep the state running, pay salaries, buy goods, and keep the system functioning. When a country holds massive oil reserves, it becomes a strategic anchor in international relationships, even if that country is weak or unstable. The video emphasizes Venezuela's huge oil potential, turning it into a major economic card in any squeeze or bargaining game. And when oil is the axis, economic pressure aimed at Venezuela isn't just a South American issue. It can spread outward through money flows and trade routes. The direct link here is the relationship between Venezuela and Iran. The video describes Venezuela as economic leverage in the Western Hemisphere for countries seen as confronting Israel and the West. The idea is simple. If Iran is sanctioned head-on, it will look for workarounds. Those workarounds can come through partners, through exchange networks, through channels that keep cash and resources moving. And Venezuela, with oil, can become part of that network. So when the United States pressures Venezuela through sanctions and economic tightening, the video treats it as a second clamp. It doesn't just hit Venezuela, it hits Iran's ability to breathe through the economic connections it could rely on. From this angle, Venezuela becomes a logical piece in the birth pangs picture described earlier. Iran is threatened with military language. Venezuela is squeezed with economic tools. Different fronts, but they generate the same overall feeling. Pressure is being distributed in multiple directions, and the tempo of leverage points is moving closer together. That sets the stage for the next section's model, economic pressure before a major event, and why the video connects it to the image of a global trade system breaking down. After positioning Venezuela as an oil gate and an economic bridge to Iran, the video moves into a key idea. In many historical stories, and in its own logic, collapse often doesn't start with gunfire. It starts with resources being drained. Money gets blocked. Trade gets squeezed. A system's ability to function starts to lose air. This kind of pressure doesn't create explosions on television, but it erodes endurance day after day. And because it happens quietly, many people only recognize it when things are already close to the breaking point. The video uses this pattern to explain why sanctions, economic crackdowns, or cutting off resource lines can be seen as clearing the path for bigger disruptions. In that frame, Venezuela becomes an easy example. Oil is what feeds the machinery. When oil exports are restricted and revenue is squeezed, a government loses the ability to pay for stability. And when a government weakens, its ties to allies weaken as well. If Venezuela is a link that helps create a buffer for Iran against sanctions, then squeezing Venezuela means shrinking the escape routes Iran might depend on. Pressure then is no longer a single spear, it becomes a web. It hits financial endurance. It makes the workarounds less effective. And when the workarounds narrow, the remaining options often become more extreme. Either concession or escalation. In both cases, tension rises. What the video emphasizes in this section is simultaneity. Iran faces pressure through the language of military deterrence. Venezuela faces pressure through economic tools. The two forms reinforce each other. It's like pushing from the front while holding tight from the back. One side creates the sense that the safety is already off. The other side slowly pulls the oxygen out of cash flow. And when those moves happen at the same time, it feels like the process is being accelerated. Not because there's one single event that's massive, but because small and mid-sized events are stacking on top of each other, leaving the system less room to breathe. From here, the video sets up the next step. If economic pressure is a pattern that appears before major disruption, then what is happening in the Middle East in parallel with these tightening moves? And is there an alliance framework being built? So the story is no longer just Iran and Venezuela, but a wider picture of regional restructuring. At this point, the video wants viewers to pause and take in the whole board. Not to watch each headline in isolation, but to see how the headlines start to stick together. Iran is pushed upward through military deterrent language. Venezuela is squeezed through sanctions and economic pressure. Two different countries, two different continents, yet they show up in the same rhythm. And that rhythm creates the sense of convergence. When multiple lines start aiming toward one point, it no longer feels like random coincidence. It feels like a trend, a process, a current being pulled into one channel. The core of convergence isn't whether the world has crises. The world always has crises. The core is that crises no longer unfold in sequence. In the past, one problem would spike and then cool down, and only then would another rise. Like ocean waves, one after another, still with gaps. But when convergence appears, the gaps shrink. Waves overlap. The next surge hits before the last one has even pulled back. The video uses that image to reconnect with the birth pangs model. It isn't the first contraction that terrifies people. It's when contractions come so fast and so hard that there's no way back. In this telling, Iran and Venezuela are treated as two sides of the same pressure strategy. Iran is the prophetic flashpoint in the video's logic, tied to Persia and the Middle East's position in the biblical story. Venezuela is a distant lever, using resources and cash flow to apply indirect impact. When both are pressured at once, the video argues this is no longer one confrontation. It's a pincer. One side is military warning language that draws a red line. The other side is economic pressure that chokes resources and weakens the support network. Together, they reduce the opponent's options, and as options shrink, the risk of extreme reaction increases. But convergence goes deeper than that. The video says that while pressure is applied to Iran and Venezuela, the Middle East is also being restructured. Countries are choosing sides. Alliances are shifting. New agreements are forming. That makes the pressure campaigns feel less like disconnected actions and more like moves serving a larger picture. And when decisions start stacking, something dangerous shows up. Decision speed increases, mistakes become easier, and every side has less time to cool things down. That becomes the transition into the next element the video highlights: peace agreements and regional realignment, especially the Abraham Accords, as an infrastructure that makes today's developments feel like more than pressure, and more like preparation for a new structure. After introducing convergence, the video widens the picture with what it treats as a central factor: the Abraham Accords. It doesn't present them as a single news item, but as a long movement that changes the structure of the Middle East. For decades, much of the Arab world held a relatively unified position. No normalization with Israel until the Palestinian issue was resolved. But the Abraham Accords are framed as a major crack in that consensus. Some Arab states began signing normalization agreements, opening the door to commercial, security, and diplomatic cooperation. For the video, this isn't just peace. It's a rearrangement of power relationships that makes older alliances less stable than before. The video explains the motive in a blunt, practical sentence. Sunni countries didn't suddenly like Israel more. They simply feared Iran more. As Iran expanded influence through proxy networks and regional lines of reach, many Arab states saw a threat that felt closer and more immediate. In that context, Israel shifted from traditional adversary to tactical partner. That shift made something once hard to imagine feel possible. Security cooperation between Israel and certain Arab states, sharing intelligence, building balance against Iran. In the video's telling, this matters because isolating Iran no longer looks like just an American or Israeli project. It starts to look like a broader regional direction. From the Abraham Accords foundation, the video moves to the idea of a covenant with many as a multilateral frame. It is careful to say this is not direct fulfillment yet, but it stresses the word infrastructure. When states establish relations, create cooperation channels, and build economic and security networks, a new mold takes shape. And once the mold exists, larger agreements become easier to form. What matters here is multilateral structure. It's no longer two sides in a room, it's many sides at once, many interests bound together, multiple mechanisms of oversight and guarantee operating at the same time. The video wants viewers to sense that the more parties are tied into one structure, the harder that structure becomes to break, and the greater the pressure becomes on whoever remains outside it. Then it highlights what it calls the prize in this picture: Saudi Arabia. Not because Saudi is closest to Israel, but because Saudi carries symbolic and political weight across the Sunni world. If Saudi moves closer to normalization, the regional order would shift far more dramatically than the earlier steps. In the video's logic, this is what makes pressure on Iran feel even more significant. Because every sanction, every warning, every squeeze on Iran's ally networks makes Arab alignment with Israel look less risky. Seen that way, Iran and Venezuela stop being separate stories. They become two pressure points designed to weaken one axis while another axis is being strengthened. And that is how the video builds the sense that the board is being cleared. Not with one single move, but with many small moves that start forming a new structure. After widening the frame with the Abraham Accords and the sense that the board is being set, the video shifts into a warning that feels more personal. It uses the image of a snare, a trap. What makes a trap terrifying isn't raw force, it's the surprise. The prey doesn't see it, it doesn't signal, it doesn't announce itself. One moment you're free, the next moment you're cinched tight. The video stresses that the danger of the end times in this reading isn't only war or crisis. It's that people get caught while they're not ready. Not because they lacked information, but because they lost alertness. And when the snare closes, everything flips too fast to turn back in time. The key is that the warning doesn't begin with "watch the world." It begins with "watch yourself." The video wants the viewer to grasp that you can read the news every day. You can know the big developments and still get trapped if your mind has been made heavy. Here, it names 3 things that overload the heart. First, being absorbed in consumption and entertainment, living to fill time with things that numb you. Second, anything that works like being drunk, meaning it dulls awareness, slows spiritual reflexes, and trains you to live in a fog. Third, the cares of life, which sounds completely reasonable because everyone has bills, work, health, family. But when those cares take over your entire mind, they become an invisible set of restraints. You lose time for long-range perspective. You live in daily survival mode. And that mode is exactly what makes the trap effective. The video connects this straight back to what it just laid out. On one side is military threat language toward Iran. On the other side is economic tightening on Venezuela. At the same time, the region is being reshaped through agreements and new alliances. Together, it creates an accelerating rhythm. But if people get swept into distraction, they only see the surface. They argue about sides, stay busy with emotion, and miss what matters. So the close of this section is a practical instruction. Recalibrate your attention. Turn down the noise. Choose again what you allow into your mind. Make space again for reflection, for prayer, for reading and comparing. Because in the video's argument, the trap doesn't catch the people who lack headlines. It catches the people who let their hearts get so weighed down that they can't react in time when everything suddenly shifts. As the video reaches its final stretch, the message is no longer centered on maps or sanctions. It moves to something closer and also easier to overlook: each person's attention. Because in an era where everything feels like it's happening all at once, the danger isn't only the upheaval out there, it's the way people get swept into its noisy tempo. News never stops, social media keeps your eyes locked in motion, entertainment fills the smallest gaps in the day, and even as the signs seem to accelerate, the mind can still be lulled to sleep by routine. The video calls this the snare that comes suddenly, because it doesn't need darkness to hide. It only needs you to stay busy. Busy enough that you don't notice you're losing your bearings, busy enough that you hear a lot, see a lot, but lose the ability to tell what actually matters. In that logic, recalibrating your attention isn't a spiritual slogan, it's a practical act. It means checking what you're giving most of your time and energy to each day, and whether those things are moving you closer to alertness or closer to numbness. What's striking is that this call doesn't demand anything extreme. The video doesn't say you have to leave everyday life. It doesn't say you have to disappear from the world. It calls for a deliberate shift. Less noise, more quiet. Less emotional reactivity, more time to think. If you spend hours scrolling, set aside a small part of that time to read and reflect. If you constantly check your phone, practice checking your own heart. Because wherever your attention goes, your heart will follow. When someone lives in a state of constant tugging, they become easier to panic, easier to anger, easier to burn out. But when they choose an anchor on purpose, they become calmer, clearer, and harder to get dragged by passing waves. And that's how the video closes. Not with a declaration that everything has been fulfilled, but with a reminder that even if you can't control the world, you can still control how you live inside it. Being alert isn't knowing every headline. Being alert is refusing to let those headlines steal your long-range perspective.